Imagine this: Egypt, the most powerful empire on earth, filled with temples, priests, and gods that ruled every corner of life. From the moment you woke up, you were surrounded by religion. Farmers prayed to Hapi for the Nile to flood. Mothers prayed to Torit for safe childbirth. Soldiers carried amulets of Horus into battle for protection. Every breath, every ritual, every heartbeat was tied to the gods. Egypt didn't just believe in its deities, it lived through them. But then, one man came along and said, "Enough." A single pharaoh decided he was smarter than 3,000 years of tradition. His name was Akhenaten, and he tried to delete all the gods. Before he became Akhenaten, he was Amenhotep IV, son of Amenhotep III, one of the most successful rulers in Egypt's history. The empire was at its peak, rich, stable, and respected across the world. The temples overflowed with offerings, and the priests of Amun, the chief god of Thebes, were immensely powerful, maybe too powerful. The priesthood controlled vast estates, armies of workers, and piles of gold rivaling the pharaoh's own treasury. To Amenhotep IV, that was a problem. He was supposed to be the living god, the divine authority, the embodiment of order. But the priests were starting to act like kings in their own right. And that's when something strange happened. Instead of trying to balance power, Amenhotep IV decided to blow the whole system up. He began to worship a lesser-known deity, Aten the sun disk. Aten was in T, a personified god with a falcon, S head, or a human body like Ra or Horus. Aten was pure light, a shining circle with rays that ended in little hands. Reaching down to touch the earth, to most Egyptians, Aten was just one aspect of Ura, the sun god. But to Amenhotep IV, Aten was everything. He declared that Aten wasn't just a god, Aten was the god. All others were lies. All other temples worthless. All other priests obsolete. This was not evolution. This was revolution, a religious coup staged by a pharaoh against his own civilization. He changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten, to show his devotion. He didn't just want people to worship Aten, he wanted to erase every other god from history. He ordered temples to be defaced, inscriptions chiseled away, statues smashed. The mighty name of Amen was cut from walls like it never existed. Thousands of years of tradition were wiped clean in a few years of fanaticism. And here's where it gets even dumber. He didn't just rewrite the religion, he rewrote how people could even talk about it. In official inscriptions, the plural word for gods was banned. You couldn't say gods at all. It was Aten or nothing. Imagine walking into a temple your ancestors built, where you once prayed to Isis or Osiris, and now finding their faces carved out, their names forbidden. For ordinary Egyptians, it must have felt like the world was being torn apart. But Akhenaten wasn't satisfied with just changing worship. He wanted to change where people lived. The great cities of Thebes and Memphis, with their temples to the old gods, were tainted. So he did what every delusional ruler eventually does. He built his own city from scratch. Out in the desert, far from any old religious center, he founded Akhenaten, the horizon of Aton. Today, we call it Amarna. It was supposed to be a perfect city for his perfect god, the first and only capital built for monotheism. The construction was rushed. Thousands of workers toiled under the blazing Egyptian sun to build palaces, temples, and houses in record time. The city's layout was strange. Open courtyards designed so Aten's light could touch everything. No roofs over the altars. No dark sanctuaries like the temples of Ammon. For Akhenaten, the sunlight itself was divine. He wanted people to feel Aten's presence in every beam of light. In theory, it sounds poetic. In practice, it was a logistical nightmare. The city was in the middle of nowhere. No major river routes, no established farms, no infrastructure. The pharaoh had basically moved Egypt's capital to the desert because of his personal obsession. While Akhenaten meditated on his sun disk, the empire began to crumble. The economy suffered because temple lands were confiscated and trade networks broke down. The priests who once organized huge parts of Egypt's daily life were stripped of their roles. Foreign policy was ignored. Letters from neighboring kingdoms pleading for help went unanswered. In the royal archives found at Amarna, you can still read desperate messages from allies saying, "We're being attacked. Where is Egypt?" But Akhenaten didn't care. He was too busy writing hymns to his god. He even micromanaged how Aten should be depicted. Artists were ordered to abandon the traditional Egyptian style. The stiff, idealized poses of pharaohs and gods were replaced by elongated, almost alien forms. Akhenaten himself was shown with narrow limbs, wide hips, and a long face, an image so strange that later generations thought he must have had a disease. But it wasn't illness, it was ideology. The new art style was meant to show Akhenaten as both man and god, not perfect, but unique, chosen. In some scenes, he's shown tenderly holding his daughters, kissing his wife Nefertiti under Aten's rays. It's one of the rare moments in Egyptian art that feels human. But beneath the warmth of the sun, Egypt was freezing to death politically and spiritually. Nefertiti, his famous queen, stood by his side, often shown nearly equal to him in size and status, something unheard of before. Together, they ruled as the high priests of Aten. Every prayer, every offering, every ritual went through them. The people could no longer connect directly to their gods. They had to go through the royal family. The pharaoh had not only fired the priests, he made himself the only one allowed to speak to heaven. That kind of control might sound powerful, but it was unsustainable. The Egyptians had grown up believing that balance kept the world in order. The Nile's floods, the harvests, the movement of the stars, all of it depended on respecting the gods. Now, with only Aten allowed, that balance was shattered. When the Nile failed to flood properly, people saw it as a divine punishment. When famine spread, they blamed the heretic pharaoh. Akhenaten might have thought he was bringing divine truth, but his people thought he had angered every god in existence. And yet, despite all the chaos, Akhenaten remained convinced he was right. In his great hymn to Aten, often called the first monotheistic prayer in history, he praised the sun disk as the creator of all life, the giver of breath, the source of love. The poetry is beautiful, no doubt, but behind the beauty was arrogance, the belief that only he understood truth, that only his vision mattered. And that's what made his reign so disastrously dumb. He didn't just try to change religion, he tried to erase identity itself. By isolating himself in Amarna, Akhenaten became the sun around which his entire empire was forced to orbit. But even the brightest star eventually burns out. The people's faith in him was fading. His officials were restless. His empire was cracking. Yet he carried on worshipping Aten in silence while Egypt's enemies gathered strength. And that's where we'll leave him for now, standing beneath his blazing sun, blinded by his own divine light, unaware that his empire is already slipping into darkness. Akhenaten's experiment wasn't just a religious mistake, it was one of the most catastrophic acts of ego in ancient history. A ruler who thought he could replace an entire civilization's soul with his own belief. If you want to see just how far this disaster went and how Egypt tried to erase him from existence after his death, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian. The next part will uncover the full collapse of Akhenaten's dream and the chaos that followed his so-called divine revolution. When Akhenaten declared that there was only one god worth worshipping, the sun, Aten he wasn't just changing religion. He was detonating a political bomb at the very heart of Egypt's power structure. The priesthood of Amen wasn't just a collection of holy men. It was an empire within an empire, wealthy, organized, and deeply entrenched in every layer of Egyptian life. The temples of Amen in Thebes weren't just places of worship. They were financial powerhouses that owned land, slaves, cattle, and gold mines. They funded armies, stored grain, and kept Egypt's economy running like clockwork. For centuries, pharaohs had depended on them as partners in rule. But Akhenaten didn't see partners. He saw competition. To him, the priests were parasites, feeding off divine authority. So he did something no ruler before him dared to do. He declared war on them. He closed their temples, seized their estates, and stripped them of their wealth. The magnificent temple of Karnak, once bursting with gold offerings and incense, fell silent. Its great halls, carved with hymns to Amen, were defaced. Statues of the god were smashed, his name erased from stone. Imagine centuries of devotion, thousands of workers, artists, and scribes all wiped away by royal decree. Overnight, the priesthood of Amen went from one of the most powerful institutions on earth to public enemies of the state. And this wasn't just a religious insult, it was economic warfare. The temples of Amen had long acted as banks and employers for tens of thousands of Egyptians. Priests oversaw trade routes, craftsmen, and vast agricultural lands. By confiscating temple wealth, Akhenaten wasn't only targeting the elite, he was ripping apart the entire economic web that kept Egypt stable. Farmers who once delivered grain to the temple granaries suddenly found their payments redirected to Aten's new shrines. Artisans who carved Amun's image now had to sculpt Aten's shining rays. The old religious industry was gutted, and a new one was being built from scratch under the pharaoh's personal control. To ordinary Egyptians, this shift felt like sacrilege. The gods weren't abstract to them, they were guardians of daily life. When Akhenaten ordered the erasure of Amun's name from monuments, people whispered that he was cursing the land itself. The Nile, the floods, the harvest, all of it was tied to divine balance, or Mat. And in the Egyptian worldview, destroying the gods wasn't just impious, it was cosmic chaos. The priests of Amun didn't need to lift a sword to fight back. They just waited. They watched as Egypt's balance began to unravel. The Theban priests were master politicians. They had outlasted kings, invasions, and dynastic shifts before. And now, though silenced officially, they began to resist quietly. In remote towns, inscriptions of Amun continued to appear on private tombs. In villages, old prayers were whispered in secret. People refused to give up their amulets of the gods. Even within Akhenaten's administration, some officials secretly stayed loyal to Amun. This wasn't just faith, it was survival. Aligning with Aten meant risking your soul if Akhenaten fell. Aligning with Amen meant waiting for the inevitable restoration of order. But Akhenaten was blind to the brewing resistance. He believed himself chosen, divinely illuminated, unstoppable. To enforce his vision, he created a network of officials and enforcers who answered only to him. They were the first real state bureaucracy in Egypt's history built around a single ideology. Their job was on to serve the people. It was to ensure that Aten's light reached every corner of the kingdom. Reports from local administrators began to pour into Amarna, describing how farmers were forced to build Aten temples, how merchants had to fund new shrines, and how even festivals honoring old gods were banned. The pharaoh's agents roamed the land, checking for religious compliance. If they found an image of Amun or Mut or Osiris, they destroyed it on sight. The priests, humiliated and dispossessed, responded in the only way they could, by undermining Akhenaten's authority from the shadows. In diplomatic circles, word spread that Egypt was losing its grip. Foreign powers who once trembled before the pharaoh now sensed weakness. The great allies of Egypt, Babylonia, Mitanni, and the Hittites began to test the limits of this new sun cult regime. They wrote letters to Akhenaten begging for gold or military support, but the pharaoh ignored them. Every time he refused, the priesthood's silent satisfaction grew. The more he isolated Egypt, the more their argument seemed justified. He has angered the gods, they must have whispered, and the gods will take their revenge. Meanwhile, Thebes itself became a ghost city. Its once grand processions and festivals, where thousands had gathered to praise Amun, vanished. The annual Opet festival, where statues of the gods were carried along the Nile in celebration, was cancelled. For Egyptians, that was like canceling New Year's Day, Christmas, and your own coronation all at once. The spiritual and social glue of the kingdom was gone. In its place stood Aten, remote, abstract, and untouchable. The priests of Amun might have lost their gold, but they gained something even more valuable: the sympathy of the people. Within the temples Akhenaten hadn't yet destroyed, loyalists preserved hidden relics. A small statue here, a secret inscription, there enough to ensure that Amun would not be forgotten. Archaeologists have found evidence of old cult symbols carved over later Atean imagery, signs that the old faith refused to die. Even within Akhenaten itself, there are traces of quiet defiance. In some private homes, tiny altars have been found dedicated not to Aten, but to base Toret and other outlawed gods. Akhenaten's dream city of devotion was already full of hidden heretics, but the pharaoh didn't see this as rebellion. To him, it was ignorance. He genuinely believed he was leading humanity into a golden age of truth. In official inscriptions, Aten is called the one who lives by truth, while Akhenaten refers to himself as the son of light. In his mind, the priests of Amun weren't wrong, they were corrupted. He saw himself as the purifier, sweeping away centuries of superstition. Yet, ironically, his monotheism didn't make religion simpler. It made it more oppressive. Egyptians were used to a pantheon that explained every part of life. Now they were told there was only one God, but that God didn't listen, didn't speak, and didn't forgive. Aten was distant. Only Akhenaten could interpret his will. This shift left the people spiritually stranded. The priesthood of Amen had once been their bridge to the divine. Now that bridge was burned. Farmers still prayed to the gods for good floods, but no priest was left to bless the river. Mothers still invoked Isis during childbirth, but her temples were locked. In the absence of the old rituals, fear took hold. What if the sun stopped rising? What if the gods never returned? The more uncertain life became, the more the priest's silent influence grew. In truth, Akhenaten's reforms were less about faith and more about control. By destroying Amen's cult, he removed the only institution that could rival his power. The Aten religion was convenient. It had no clergy, no tradition, no scripture. That meant Akhenaten himself was the sole interpreter of divine will. Every offering, every hymn, every act of worship flowed directly through him. The Pharaoh had become not just a political ruler, but the only priest in Egypt who mattered. To the priests of Amen, this was not enlightenment. It was tyranny disguised as piety. And though they were silent, their revenge was already forming. Egypt was built on continuity, on the idea that the gods upheld order and the Pharaoh upheld the gods. By breaking that balance, Akhenaten had broken Egypt itself. The priesthood didn't need to revolt with swords or armies. They just had to wait for the inevitable collapse his arrogance would bring. In the deserts of Amarna, under the blazing Aten, Akhenaten ruled as though his enemies were gone. But back in Thebes, in the quiet, empty halls of Karnak, the priests of Amen were already writing their next chapter, in patience, in secret, and in stone. The Pharaoh thought he had erased them. In truth, they were waiting for the day Egypt remembered who it truly worshipped. When Akhenaten decided that Egypt needed a new city, one untouched by the corrupt shadows of the old gods, he didn't just choose a new capital. He chose exile. In a single reckless stroke, he abandoned Thebes, the beating heart of Egypt's religion, politics, and history, and ordered the construction of an entirely new city in the middle of the desert. He called it Akhenaten, the horizon of the Atan. It was meant to be a perfect symbol of his divine vision, a holy city dedicated entirely to the sun. In reality, it was a logistical disaster, a monument to obsession that drained Egypt's wealth, broke its government, and pushed its empire closer to collapse. Building a new capital from nothing might sound visionary, but for a nation as vast and interconnected as Egypt, it was a bureaucratic nightmare. Thebes had everything: temples, treasuries, government offices, a trained workforce, access to the Nile, and centuries of infrastructure. Akhenaten had sand, scorpions, and a dream. There was no reason to build there except Akhenaten's personal whim. The site was remote and barren, surrounded by cliffs and far from established trade routes. Moving the entire royal court, the army's command structure, artisans, administrators, and scribes required massive manpower. Thousands of laborers and slaves were pulled from farms, quarries, and workshops across Egypt to build this spiritual utopia. The project was rushed and chaotic. Inscriptions found at Amarna show that Akhenaten wanted the city completed quickly. Some say within just a few years, so Egypt's resources were thrown into overdrive. Food, stone, timber, copper, and manpower were diverted from every corner of the empire. Ships that once carried grain for trade or war were redirected to haul limestone blocks for temples to Aten. The treasury, already strained by the loss of temple revenues from Thebes, was bled dry to feed Akhenaten's vanity project. Craftsmen who might have been working on fortifications or tombs were reassigned to carve reliefs of the pharaoh and his sun god. The result was predictable: inflation, food shortages, and a slowdown in every other major state operation. Yet Akhenaten saw it as destiny. To him, Akhenaten wasn't just a city, it was a living act of worship. Every structure, from the grand temples to the smallest homes, was aligned to capture the light of the rising sun. The main temple to Aten had no roof, symbolizing that the god was not confined by walls, but the open design meant that ceremonies happened under the scorching desert heat, with priests and workers fainting beneath the blinding sun. Every aspect of the city screamed devotion and delusion. The pharaoh and his queen Nefertiti were depicted constantly offering flowers and bread to Aten, their faces illuminated by rays ending in tiny hands reaching down from the sun. Meanwhile, the rest of Egypt suffered. Administrators who were forced to relocate complained of endless travel times and poor communication with the rest of the empire. The kingdom's borders were thousands of kilometers away, and Akhenaten was nowhere near Egypt's key military posts or trade centers. Messages from the frontiers took weeks to reach the pharaoh, and by the time he responded, it was often too late. Foreign diplomats from places like Babylonia and the Hittite Empire wrote increasingly desperate letters, begging for Egypt's help or complaining that their messengers were ignored. These letters, known today as the Amarna letters, show just how detached Akhenaten had become. While his empire began to crumble, he was too busy composing hymns to the sun. Inside the city, the atmosphere was both sacred and suffocating. Everything revolved around Aten. Art changed dramatically under Akhenaten's rule. Traditional Egyptian art had always been idealized. Pharaohs appeared strong, symmetrical, and divine. But in Amarna, Akhenaten ordered his artists to show him and his family in a disturbingly realistic way. He appeared with elongated limbs, narrow eyes, a protruding belly, and wide hips, features that have puzzled historians for centuries. Some say it was a medical condition. Others believe it was symbolic, blending masculine and feminine traits to show the pharaoh as the living embodiment of creation. Whatever the reason, it added to the surreal atmosphere of the new capital. Daily life in Akhenaten was harsh. The sun god demanded an open-air city, but the desert offered no mercy. Workers toiled under brutal heat, building endless temples and shrines. The Nile was nearby, but not close enough to provide easy irrigation or transportation. Water had to be hauled long distances, food supplies were limited, and disease spread quickly in the crowded workers' quarters. Archaeological excavations of Amarna's burial grounds reveal skeletons with signs of malnutrition, broken bones, and exhaustion, proof that the city's construction was paid for in human suffering. And yet, Akhenaten seemed oblivious to the misery around him. He surrounded himself with loyalists who echoed his vision and silenced dissent. Court officials wrote hymns praising Aten's light, while secretly wondering how long they could survive in this artificial paradise. Even Nefertiti, once his devoted partner, began to disappear from official records near the end of his reign, suggesting that even she may have grown weary of his fanaticism. The old priesthood's absence was deeply felt. In Thebes, priests had acted as administrators, record keepers, and mediators between the pharaoh and the people. At Amarna, Akhenaten replaced them with bureaucrats who were more loyal than competent. They followed his orders, but the kingdom's organization fell apart. Tax collection slowed, local governors grew corrupt, and Egypt's outer territories, especially in Syria and Canaan, began slipping away. The once mighty Egyptian empire, which had dominated the Near East for centuries, started to crumble piece by piece, while the pharaoh obsessed over sunlight and theology. The economy suffered next. With resources funneled into the construction of Amarna, trade networks were neglected. Merchants found it harder to move goods across the desert, and local farmers were forced into labor instead of tending their fields. Inflation rose and shortages became common. The great temples of old had once served as warehouses and distribution centers during hard times, but now they were closed, their granaries empty, their priests silenced. When famine struck, there was no safety net left. Egypt's people began to lose faith not only in Aten, but in the pharaoh himself. Yet, despite all this suffering, Akhenaten remained convinced he was guiding Egypt into a new age of purity. In his mind, the old gods were corrupt, their priests greedy, and their rituals false. Only Aten was truth. He built colossal open-air temples that glittered with white stone, designed so that the sun's rays could strike every corner. But those rays also burned. The same light that illuminated his divine vision scorched his city, cracked its walls, and baked the land around it into dust. By the later years of his reign, Amarna had become a ghost of its original promise. The city was unfinished, its outer districts barely built, its workforce dwindling. The pharaoh's health declined, and his attention turned inward. He commissioned songs praising Aten's eternal light, while ignoring the political darkness creeping across Egypt. Military outposts fell to invaders, and foreign envoys complained that Egypt no longer paid its debts or honored its alliances. In the shadows, the priests of Ammon must have smiled grimly. Akhenaten had given them their revenge without them lifting a single blade. What makes Akhenaten truly tragic is how quickly it vanished after Akhenaten's death. Within a few years, it was abandoned, its temples stripped, its statues smashed. The city built to glorify Aten was reclaimed by the desert, erased from memory until archaeologists rediscovered it millennia later. For a brief moment, it had been the center of the world, then it became the ultimate symbol of folly. The city that proved what happens when faith blinds reason. Akhenaten was meant to be eternal. Instead, it became a ruin almost as soon as it was completed. A monument not to divine vision, but to one man's arrogance and the empire he broke trying to build it. So if you've made it this far, remember, the story isn't over yet. Hit that like button, leave a comment with your thoughts on Akhenaten's desert dream. And make sure you subscribe to Dumb Historians so you don't miss the next chapter of this unbelievable tale. When Akhenaten turned his gaze to the blazing sun of Aten, he turned his back on the rest of the world. Egypt, once a mighty empire that stretched from the Nile to the edges of Syria, began to fade under his rule. The Pharaoh, who claimed to speak for the light of heaven, allowed the darkness of neglect to swallow his empire. While he was composing hymns and building temples to Aten, his vassals Egypt's allies and subjects were being invaded, overrun, and destroyed. His obsession with religion blinded him to the crumbling reality around him. For centuries, Egypt had been the dominant power in the Near East. Through trade, diplomacy, and conquest, it held sway over dozens of smaller kingdoms places like Byblos, Tyre, Megiddo, and Ugarit. These city-states paid tribute to Egypt, sent gifts to the pharaoh, and relied on his armies for protection. It was a stable system built on fear and respect. But that balance began to collapse when Akhenaten came to power and decided that religion mattered more than reality. The heart of this disaster is revealed in one of history's most haunting collections of documents, the Amarna letters. These are clay tablets discovered at Akhenaten, written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the time. They are desperate, pleading messages from foreign rulers and Egyptian governors, begging for help while their cities burned. The tone of these letters is almost tragic. You can sense the confusion, the fear, and the growing disbelief as the pharaoh's silence stretched on. One ruler, Ribahata of Byblos, wrote to Akhenaten again and again, warning him that enemy forces were attacking his lands. In one letter, he practically begs, "Send archers, my lord, or all will be lost." His city was surrounded, his people starving, and his neighbors betraying him, but the pharaoh never responded. In another letter, a governor from Canaan warns that the Hittites, Egypt's powerful northern rivals, are advancing into Egyptian territory. Still, no answer. These letters pile up unanswered cries for help that show just how far Akhenaten had drifted from the reality of his empire. What was the pharaoh doing while his empire burned? He was overseeing temple rituals, commissioning new hymns, and directing the construction of yet another shrine to Aten. To him, the world outside Egypt's borders was irrelevant. Aten's light, he believed, shone only on Egypt and, specifically, on him. Foreign lands were secondary distractions from his divine mission. Even as Egypt's allies fell and enemies advanced, Akhenaten refused to send troops. He saw war as a relic of the old gods, a dirty affair unworthy of Aten's followers. But this spiritual purity came at a devastating cost. Egypt's control over Akhenaten and Syria began to crumble. The Hittites pushed southward, taking key trade cities and cutting off routes that had supplied Egypt with timber, metals, and tribute for generations. The Amorites and Mitanni, once Egyptian allies, shifted their loyalty or were simply wiped out. Egypt's once feared military machine and institution that had conquered Nubia and defeated great empires sat idle while its reputation disintegrated. At home, generals and soldiers grew restless. Egypt's army had always been central to its power and pride. Campaigns in foreign lands weren't just about defense. They were about maintaining the flow of wealth and prestige, but under Akhenaten, they were left to rot. There were no new campaigns, no triumphs to celebrate, no spoils of war. Officers who once commanded legions were reduced to temple guards or overseers of construction. Some may have turned against the pharaoh quietly, waiting for his reign to end so they could restore Egypt's strength. The neglect wasn't just military, it was economic. When Egypt lost control of its vassal states, it also lost access to crucial trade networks. The ports of Byblos and Tyre had supplied cedar wood from Lebanon, used in Egypt's temples and ships. the copper mines of Cyprus provided metal for tools and weapons. Syria's cities brought in horses, silver, and luxury goods. As these regions slipped away, the flow of goods stopped and Egypt's economy withered. The grand construction projects at Akhenaten continued, but they were funded by a treasury running dry. Imagine Egypt as a great ship drifting in calm waters while storms gather all around it. The captain, lost in thought, prays to the sun instead of steering the wheel. His crew shouts warnings, "The waves are rising! The hull is cracking!" but he doesn't listen. That was Akhenaten's Egypt. By the time the damage was visible to everyone, it was too late to repair. The psychological impact on Egypt's people was immense. For ordinary citizens, the pharaoh was supposed to be the protector of both the land and the heavens. Akhenaten's ancestors had been warrior kings who expanded Egypt's borders and filled its temples with the spoils of conquest. Now they had a king who worshipped a god no one understood and ignored the world beyond his city walls. Reports of lost battles and fallen allies spread, undermining confidence in his divine authority. If Aton was truly supreme, people wondered, why were Egypt's enemies growing stronger? Even within the court, cracks began to form. Advisors and scribes knew that the situation was unsustainable. Some must have tried to reach him, warning of the Hittites and rebellions in the north. But Akhenaten was surrounded by loyalists who told him what he wanted to hear, that Aten's light would protect Egypt, that foreign troubles were insignificant, that divine truth mattered more than diplomacy. The few who dared to question him risked exile or execution. One of the most striking things about Akhenaten's reign is how completely he detached the role of pharaoh from the rest of the world. Previous rulers had balanced religion and politics. Seeing both as parts of the divine order of balance, Akhenaten broke that balance entirely. To him, politics was dust compared to the glory of Aten. This might have given him spiritual satisfaction, but it destroyed the very foundation of Egyptian civilization. The loss of Egypt's foreign territories also changed its identity. For centuries, Egypt had seen itself as the center of the known world of power so great that even distant kings sent tribute. But under Akhenaten, that prestige evaporated. Foreign envoys stopped visiting. Tribute stopped flowing. The pharaoh's name became a joke among former allies who saw his weakness. The empire's outer provinces were carved up by opportunistic rivals, and Egypt's aura of invincibility was shattered. The irony is that Akhenaten's religious ideals, his belief in light, purity, and harmony, brought only chaos and decay. He preached that Aten's light nourished all things, yet his neglect plunged Egypt into darkness. His obsession with divine unity broke the unity of his empire. He wanted eternal peace, but invited destruction instead. Every decision he made in the name of faith widened the cracks in Egypt's political and social structure. By the end of his reign, Egypt was a shadow of its former self. The once great network of vassal states had vanished. The treasury was empty, the army demoralized, and the people weary. The pharaoh, who had dreamed of creating a perfect world under the sun, was now ruling over a country dimmed by loss. Foreign nations that once feared Egypt no longer bothered to send envoys or gifts. They saw what Egypt had become, giant distracted by its own delusions. In his quest to serve the heavens, Akhenaten forgot the earth beneath his feet. His temples to Aten gleamed in the desert light. But his empire, once the envy of the world, was collapsing in the shadows beyond the horizon. What had taken generations of pharaohs to build, he managed to let slip away in little more than a decade. The letters from foreign rulers still survive, their clay tablets cracked, but their message clear, a record of pleas that went unanswered, of alliances betrayed, of an empire that lost its way. They are the voice of a world calling out to a pharaoh who no longer listened, ruler so consumed by his god that he forgot his people. And that silence, more than any war or rebellion, was what truly destroyed Egypt's power. When Akhenaten died, Egypt didn't just move on, it buried him. The pharaoh who tried to rewrite the laws of heaven was erased from history by his own people. His monuments were torn down, his statues smashed, and his name chiseled out from every wall and inscription that once honored him. The god he created, Aten, was abandoned, and the old gods, the ones he had dared to silence, returned with vengeance. It was one of the most thorough and deliberate acts of historical erasure ever carried out in the ancient world. Akhenaten's grand revolution, which had turned Egypt upside down, ended in complete collapse. The moment he died, the fragile world he built began to unravel. The priests of Ammon, long humiliated and stripped of power, wasted no time reclaiming their temples and restoring their god to the center of Egyptian life. The new pharaoh, a young boy named Tutankhaten, quickly changed his name to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. That name change alone was a declaration of war against everything Akhenaten had stood for. Under his advisors, the capital was moved back to Thebes, and the Aten temples in Amarna were abandoned to the desert. It didn't take long before Akhenaten's name became poison. The people were told to forget him. In Egyptian belief, to erase someone's name was to kill their soul for eternity. The chisels of masons became instruments of spiritual execution. Across the land, artisans were ordered to destroy the pharaoh's image wherever it appeared. Reliefs of Akhenaten and his family, once carved lovingly in the sunlight of Aten, were mutilated beyond recognition. His cartouches, the sacred ovals that carried royal names, were scraped away until the stone beneath was bare. At Amarna, the city that had once been his holy experiment, silence took over. The wind-filled empty courtyards where priests once sang hymns to the sun. Temples stood roofless and broken. Workers scavenged stone blocks to reuse in new construction back in Thebes. Akhenaten, the horizon of Aton, disappeared into the desert, leaving behind only broken statues and half-buried ruins. It was as if the Egyptians wanted the desert itself to swallow Akhenaten's dream. The priests of Ammon were thorough. They didn't just destroy, they rewrote. The official king lists the sacred records that chronicled Egypt's divine rulers skipped over Akhenaten entirely, as if he had never existed. His years on the throne were erased, the timeline patched together to close the gap. To later generations, there was simply no record of the pharaoh who defied the gods. In his place stood an empty silence, a deliberate historical black hole. This was not just revenge, it was restoration. Egypt had been thrown off balance by Akhenaten's obsession, and the return to the old gods was an attempt to restore Manat, the principle of cosmic order. Every stone removed from his temples, every image of Aten destroyed, was seen as an act of purification. The priests believed they were cleansing Egypt of heresy. To them, Akhenaten wasn't a misguided dreamer. He was a heretic who had endangered the entire nation. Even the art of his reign was buried with him. The elongated faces, soft bodies, and intimate family scenes that defined the Amarna style were replaced by traditional forms of rigid, idealized beauty. In less than a generation, Akhenaten's radical realism was forgotten. Artists went back to sculpting perfect, timeless pharaoh symbols of divine stability, not fragile mortals who looked too human. The artistic revolution he sparked was wiped from memory, just like his religion. But perhaps the most brutal part of his erasure was personal. The royal tombs built for him and his family were desecrated. Inscriptions were hacked apart, the names of Aten and Akhenaten both removed. Even the body of the pharaoh himself vanished from history for centuries. Some believe his remains were destroyed, others that they were reburied in secret to prevent the curse of his memory from spreading. Archaeologists have found fragments of coffins, shattered reliefs, and sarcophagi, but no confirmed mummy. For a ruler obsessed with divine immortality, this was the ultimate irony, to have no resting place, no name, and no legacy. Tutankhamun's short reign became the undoing of Akhenaten's revolution. Temples to Amun rose again across the Nile Valley. Offerings poured in, festivals returned, and the people rejoiced in the rebirth of their gods. The state propaganda machine worked overtime to frame this as a victory of truth over falsehood. In the inscriptions that survive from Tutankhamun's reign, Akhenaten is described only as the enemy, or the one who ignored the gods. His city, his religion, and his entire ideology were condemned as blasphemy. And yet, history has a strange sense of humor. For nearly 3,000 years, no one remembered his name. Akhenaten was a ghost, a missing piece of Egypt's story. His city lay hidden under sand, his temples forgotten, his god's name unspoken. The world that had once revolved around Aten vanished so completely that even scholars in later dynasties had no idea it had ever existed. Egypt continued, stronger and prouder under rulers who followed the old ways, and Akhenaten's reign became nothing more than a faint scar in the record. It wasn't until the 19th century, when archaeologists began digging at Amarna, that his name returned from the dust. The discovery of his city shocked historians. Here was an entire capital frozen in time, houses, workshops, palaces all built for a religion no one had ever heard of. Walls still bore images of the strange, radiant sun god with its reaching rays. Among the ruins, they found inscriptions bearing the name Akhenaten. The pharaoh, who had been erased from memory, had, against all odds, resurfaced. But even today, his legacy is one of failure. His grand experiment achieved nothing lasting. He wanted to unite Egypt under one god, and instead divided it beyond repair. He dreamed of being remembered as a divine reformer, but his name became synonymous with arrogance and folly. Every other pharaoh sought eternity through temples and monuments. Akhenaten sought it through ideology and lost both. There's something haunting about how completely his people rejected him. It wasn't just political, it was emotional. Akhenaten didn't just lose power, he lost love. The same craftsmen who once carved his likeness under the blazing sun later took their chisels and destroyed him. The same scribes who once wrote hymns to Aten later scratched out his words. He became a cautionary tale told in whispers. The king, who thought he was wiser than the gods, and paid the price. Egypt, the land of eternal life, made sure his spirit would find none. His reign didn't end with a rebellion or an invasion. It ended with silence. No great battle, no noble death, just the slow, systematic destruction of everything he ever built. His temples became rubble, his city a ghost, his god forgotten. The pharaoh, who once commanded the sun to rise on his vision of the world, was left in darkness. In the end, Akhenaten's story isn't just about religion, it's about how far one man can push against the weight of tradition before it crushes him. His vision was too strange, too sudden, too self-centered for a civilization that had spent thousands of years perfecting its balance between gods, kings, and people. Egypt's response was brutal but effective. Erased the heretic, restored the world. And yet, despite all the efforts to wipe him out, here we are still talking about him more than 3 millennia later. Maybe, in a twisted way, that's the one victory he got. The pharaoh who tried to erase the gods couldn't stop history from remembering his failure. If you've enjoyed this dive into one of the strangest and most self-destructive experiments in ancient history, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian for more tales of history as greatest blunders and the people who made them.